Okay, let's dive right into this explainer and, really look under the hood of British policies in India. For centuries, the colonial administration managed this entire incredibly diverse subcontinent, and they definitely didn't do it by accident. It required these fascinating, complex, and highly structured systems of governance. So today, we're unpacking the actual mechanisms of that control matrix. By looking closely at the historical data, the legislative records, and the broader imperial strategies, we're going to see exactly how this immense power structure functioned on a day-to-day basis.
Now, it really all boils down to this one question. Did British policies aim to modernize India or just control it? It's a dilemma that defines centuries of colonial rule. I mean, when you look back at the introduction of railways, telegraphs, Western education, it's super tempting to just see a straightforward narrative of modernization. But the historical reality, it's a web of glaring contradictions. As we peel back the layers here, we're going to find a system where progress was actually, quite often, just a byproduct of extraction and subjugation.
So here's our roadmap for this explainer. First, we'll look at the modernization dilemma, then a major reactionary pivot, followed by censorship and social control, a look at the labor hypocrisy, and finally, securing empires and borders. Let's get right to it.
Section 1. The Modernization Dilemma.
To truly understand the origins of these policies, we really have to put ourselves in the mindset of the British administration back in the early 19th century, right around 1813. Prior to this, the British largely followed a policy of non-interference when it came to India's social and cultural life. They were just there to trade and collect revenue, plain and simple. But then, Europe experienced these massive cultural shifts, the Industrial, Intellectual, and French revolutions. This wave of what they called New Thought started taking hold in Britain. It rested on three main pillars. First, rationalism, which championed a scientific attitude. Second, humanism, emphasizing an inherent respect for every individual. And third, the doctrine of progress, this belief that societies aren't static. They have to change and evolve with time. So the central, honestly agonizing question for colonial policymakers became, how on earth do you apply these advanced, progressive European ideals to a subjugated population abroad without entirely losing control over them?
Well, this ideological clash completely fractured the British establishment into three distinct camps. First, you had the conservatives, figures like Warren Hastings, Edmund Burke, and Thomas Monroe. They felt Indian civilization wasn't necessarily inferior, just different. So they advocated for minimizing changes and respecting traditional structures. Then, you had the paternalistic imperialists, who really gained a lot of influence after 1800. They were sharply critical of Indian culture, viewed it as backward, and, conveniently, used that critique to justify economic and political enslavement under the guise of bringing civilization. And finally, you had the radicals. They genuinely wanted to apply those advanced humanistic ideals directly to India to uplift the population.
Caught in a trap of their own making, the government had to make a choice. They absolutely recognized that some modernization was necessary just to run a profitable empire. But they were deeply, deeply paranoid that too much progress would generate forces hostile to their own interests. Their solution? A hesitant, highly calculated approach known as colonial modernization. Basically, they'd introduce progress in highly specific areas to maximize profit, like building railways strictly to transport troops and raw materials, but they would deliberately construct roadblocks in other areas of society to ensure they maintained absolute authority. So it was progress, sure, but strictly on their terms.
Section 2. The reactionary pivot.
This right here is the absolute hinge of our story. It's the moment the entire colonial strategy shifted, dramatically and permanently. See, pre-1857, despite all their hesitations, the British actually did entertain some intentions of modernizing India along those progressive lines we just talked about. But the massive uprisings of 1857 completely shattered that illusion. It was a profound shock to the British system, so post-1858, the reality completely flipped. The administration abandoned any lingering progressive hesitation and adopted blatantly reactionary policies. Their new operating philosophy was pretty dark but simple. They decided that Indians were fundamentally unfit for self-governance, and therefore they required a permanent, heavy-handed British presence.
Terrified of another united mass action like that 1857 uprising, the administration deployed a naked policy of divide and rule. To maintain their grip, they systematically targeted literally every conceivable social fault line they could find. They pitted princes against their own people, fractured regions and provinces against one another, exploited complex caste dynamics, and actively fanned the flames of division between Hindus and Muslims. By elevating one group while marginalizing another, they ensured the Indian population remained internally fractured. It was a massive, incredibly deliberate campaign of social engineering designed strictly for imperial self-preservation.
And this strategy led to a profound shift in alliances.
During the Indian Renaissance, local reformers had been working incredibly hard to eradicate traditional social evils. But as an educated, middle-class nationalist leadership began to emerge, especially after the Indian National Congress was founded in 1885, the British started seeing them as a direct threat. So in just a masterclass of irony, the supposedly progressive British administration actively withdrew their support from those social reforms. Instead, they aligned themselves with the most reactionary, socially orthodox elements of society, the princes and the zamindars. They literally allied with the past to suppress the future.
Moving on to Section 3, Censorship and Social Control.
Now let's dig into the specific, everyday tools the administration weaponized to stifle this growing nationalist movement. The printing press quickly became a massive battleground. Nationalists were incredibly quick to use new printing tech to educate the public and arouse national consciousness. Early on, there were actually moments of leniency, like in 1835 when Charles Metcalfe lifted press restrictions. But yeah, that freedom was incredibly short-lived. By 1878, terrified by the rapid influence of Indian-language newspapers, Lord Lytton slammed the door shut with the infamous Vernacular Press Act. Now, massive public outcry did force its repeal in 1882, but as anti-colonial movements gained immense momentum in the early 20th century, the administration panicked again. They brought severe repression right back with harsh new restrictions in 1908 and 1910. It was just this constant yo-yo effect, driven entirely by colonial fear.
But censorship wasn't just on paper. It was built in iron and stone across the physical landscape. The colonial rulers carefully and brutally maintained the notion of white superiority as an everyday mechanism of control. The administration systematically excluded Indians from higher grades in the civil and military services, which ensured structural dominance. But it also extended to daily, visceral humiliations, literally banning locals from specific railway compartments, public parks, hotels, and clubs in their own country. This segregation was frequently enforced by public displays of racial arrogance and violence. It wasn't just policy, it was a pervasive physical matrix of control designed to break the spirit.
Which brings us to Section 4, the labor hypocrisy.
By examining the economic data and labor laws of the time, we uncover one of the most glaring double standards of the entire colonial period. In 19th century India, factory and plantation conditions were absolutely miserable. We're talking grueling hours for men, women, and children, starvation wages, and almost zero safety measures. But here is the fascinating twist. The sudden push to regulate these harsh conditions, it didn't come from a sudden burst of British empathy or progressive humanism. Nope, it came directly from the Lancashire textile capitalist lobby in Britain. They were terrified, absolutely terrified, that cheap, entirely unregulated Indian labor would create a highly competitive rival to their own textile industry. So greed, not humanism, is what actually sparked the reform.
This competitive panic resulted in highly specific, incredibly weak legislation. Take the 1881 Indian Factory Act. It barely scratched the surface. It only banned child labor for kids under the age of 7 and restricted children's working hours to 9 per day. I mean, think about that benchmark. A child of 7 working 9 hours a day was considered a reform. A decade later, the 1891 Act bumped the minimum working age up to a mere 9 years old and capped women's working hours at 11 per day. Men's hours? Completely unregulated. These were microscopic concessions, designed way more to appease British capitalists than to actually protect Indian workers.
But here is the brutal punchline that truly exposes the whole system. None of these factory laws, as microscopic as they were, apply to British-owned tea and coffee plantations. There, labor continued to be ruthlessly exploited, treated literally like slaves, entirely unchecked by the very government writing the regulations. It's a stunning historical reality. Policy was aggressively weaponized to hinder Indian-owned industries under the guise of labor rights, while simultaneously fiercely protecting the abusive practices of British owners.
Finally, Section 5, Securing Empires and Borders.
We've seen how colonial paranoia and economic self-interest shaped internal policy, right? Now let's see how that exact same mindset translated outward into an aggressive foreign policy. The British government of India was basically driven by 3 unyielding aims: fiercely protecting their invaluable Indian empire, expanding their own commercial interests at absolutely all costs, and aggressively keeping competing European powers out of Asia and Africa. This intense paranoia over losing the jewel in their crown led to what was often called the Great Game. The government was constantly pushing to secure natural geographical frontiers for defense, and this insatiable need for a massive buffer zone, it frequently resulted in violent, costly border clashes with neighboring countries, all orchestrated from desks in Calcutta and London.
And maintaining this massive imperial defense, fighting these endless frontier wars, it came at an astronomical domestic cost. A disproportionately huge amount of Indian revenue was just dumped straight into the army, civil administration, and border conflicts. The result? Education, health, sanitation, and physical infrastructure were completely starved of funds. Whatever sparse social facilities actually did exist catered almost exclusively to elite sections and urban areas. So this massive misallocation of resources left a devastating legacy of underdevelopment that targeted and hindered the vast majority of the population for generations.
Which brings us to our final takeaway for this explainer. The British administration meticulously built a matrix of partial modernization, structural division, and censorship to maintain absolute profitable control. Yet, the great irony of this entire era is that the very systems of modern education, law, and communication they introduced to solidify their empire were ultimately mastered by Indian reformers. They literally took the master's tools, meticulously dissected the exploitative nature of colonial rule, and used those exact same structures to forcefully demand liberty, equality, and justice. So it really makes you wonder, right? If the tools of modernization were built for control, how did educated Indians ultimately use them to break free? Thank you for joining me for this explainer, and remember, always keep questioning the history behind the data.